Hey guys, this is Kate, and in this tutorial I will show you how to paint a sphere with watercolor pencils using the different techniques I demonstrated in the previous video. I will also show you how to use a water brush pen and why it is so very different from blending with a brush, and how to achieve interesting texture. If you still haven't seen the previous 12 techniques video, I will leave a link in the description. This is the first part of the sphere tutorial. I will be doing the second part very soon. So, let's begin. I will be using Fabriano cold press watercolor paper. It has a beautiful texture to it and is not as expensive as Arches, and so it is great for studies and good to use while you are learning. I will need two colors from the same color family, one lighter, which will be the base color of the sphere, and one darker for the shadow. I will also use a gray for the cast shadow to ground my sphere and not have it floating in the emptiness. I'm using two blues, number 18 and 56 from Kohinoor Mondeluz brand. I did color swatches and wrote down the number of each pencil because you will see that sometimes the color of the pencil itself is not quite the same as what you get when you activate the pigment. For this tutorial you can use any color you like as long as it's from the same color family, as I said, yellows or reds or purples and so on. First, I'm drawing out a sphere with the lightest base color. I move my arm from my shoulder to get it nice and round. Then I map out where my highlights will be and where the shadow will be. As spheres are round, you will notice that there is some reflected light on the left, right after the shadow. I'm not using graphite as I don't want any lines to show when the painting is ready, and using the same watercolor pencil will blend it into the initial drawing. I layer my light blue all over the sphere except for the highlights, and I will be using the white of the paper for my lightest value without using the white pencil. I do not put a lot of pressure on the pencil but layer instead. I pass over the middle area multiple times as that will be the mid-tone of my sphere. Not as dark as the shadow but not as light as the lightest part of the sphere. Then I layer my dark blue over the shadow, creating a gradient. I then pass over the part that will be to the right of the shadow multiple times with my lighter blue again to create a smoother transition. Sorry for the shaky image, my camera was attached to the desk and it shook a bit when I was layering the pencils. Then, with my gray, I layer the cast shadow. From where the light is falling, it will be darker right under the sphere and disperse as it moves further away. For blending this sphere, I will be using the water brush pen. I make sure that it is not dirty and then I start to activate the pigment from the lightest areas, moving into the darkest. I do not have a fancy brush pen, it's just the cheap Chinese one I got off eBay, but it does its work great. I know there are the Pentel brushes, I have the ink brush from Pentel which is awesome, but I still have to get my hands on one of these. So, as I move from the lightest into the darkest area, I make sure I make tiny circular movements to create a smooth transition between the values. The great thing about watercolor pencils is that they reactivate very easily, and if you have some parts that are not as smooth as you want them to be, you can always come back and smooth them out later. I'm careful with the dark blue so as to not pull too much of it into the reflected light of my sphere. Otherwise, if I lose it, then the sphere will look flat and will be kind of a circle instead of a 3D object. You can always lift the color off of some areas if you want. I will show you how to do that a bit later. I constantly make sure that my brush is clean when I go into the lighter areas. I will also blend out some areas where it's not as smooth as I want it to be. I blend the shadow. I want to make it darker, so I pass with my gray while the paper is still wet. This will make the gray that I layer over the wet area a lot more saturated. So I passed over this area of the shadow and dragged the pigment away too much and created kind of a light patch in the middle. I tried fixing it while it's still wet by picking the paint off the pencil, but with each stroke it just kind of dragged the paint away more, so I will fix it later when the paint dries. Now let's draw another sphere using the same two blues, but this time I will pick up the pencil off of the paper and paint with it as if it were watercolor paint. You will see the difference between these two techniques, and I will also do blending with a synthetic brush instead of the water brush, and you will see how different these two approaches are. I will make my drawing first with the light blue, always moving from my shoulder, not just the wrist. I also map out my highlights and my shadow. Now I put some pencil onto the paper to lift it with my brush later. Textured paper works best for lifting the paint as you manage to put more pigment onto the paper. Textured paper works best for lifting the paint as you manage to put more pigment onto the paper compared to the completely smooth one. I pick up the pigment with my wet brush and start painting as if it were watercolor paint, leaving the highlight white. I blend it so it has a smooth gradient. Then, I take more water and dilute the paint more to create a smooth transition. As I almost lost my highlight, I lifted the pigment off with a clean tissue. Now, I go into the dark blue, working wet and wet. This will help me blend the two blues better than as if I were to paint the darker onto the dry layer of the lighter blue. I also soften the edges carefully not to lose the reflected light. I return to my lighter blue to make the transition smoother, and I clean my brush to make sure that I do not put blue onto the white highlight. Again, the dark blue to have a darker shadow. I do the same with my gray for the shadow. I need the shadow to be darker right under the sphere, so I pick up the pigment directly from the pencil, but it's not dark enough, so I pass with my gray over the wet. This way, it will be a lot more saturated, but be careful when drawing on wet with watercolor pencils, as the marks will not move and will be very prominent. I will show you how it looks with the next sphere that we do in the second tutorial for the spheres. Now I want to add some more highlights to the reflected light, so I lift the pigment with a clean wet brush. I go back to my first sphere and fix the patch with a dry pencil and blend it in. You can see how different the two look. Even though I use the same pencils, because the brush pen has a steady flow of water, it allows a richer pigment saturation, and whereas using a brush you always have to load it with water, and it's always going to carry more water than the brush pen does, and as a result you get more water on the bristles that dilutes the pigment more. Now let's add some cool texture to the second sphere. I wanted to draw a ball of yarn, and dry pencil over the blended lighter area will do the trick. First, I sketch out some threads of yarn on the sphere with my light blue. Then, with the dark blue, I draw a section that intersects the previous lines. If you look at the yarn ball, you will see that there are these threads crisscrossing in all directions, and there will be some sections that are made up of multiple threads that all go into the same direction. Next, I draw another section, making sure that I draw into the direction of the threads. The layer underneath will show through the dry pencil and will create depth. I continue drawing in section and adding some more threads that all go in their own direction, crisscrossing each other, and I make sure that I have sections, so I work in sections. This will make it look more realistic. By altering light and dark blue, I continue to add more texture. Also, notice how I make the dry pencil marks go a bit over the edge of the sphere itself. This is because yarn has some thickness to it, and each section would stand out on top of the ball. I will add the little loose thread. This is it for this part of the tutorial, and I will be posting the second part very soon, and I will show you what to avoid when painting with watercolor pencils and how to make grainy texture for wood or rocks. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, click the like button, do subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao!